Homeless veteran found an abandoned cabin in the woods. What he saw inside changed his life. If you've ever walked a road with no destination in mind, only the need to keep moving, then maybe you already know Thomas, though you've never met him. And if stories of quiet courage and second chances warm something in your chest on cold nights like these, subscribe now, stay close to the fire, and tell us in the comments where you're listening from tonight, because our dream is simple: to reach 1,000 hearts gathered around this flame. Strangers who understand that some of the best stories are the ones nobody shouts about. The snow had been falling for 3 days when Thomas finally admitted to himself that he was lost, though lost is perhaps the wrong word. You cannot lose a place you were never trying to find, and he had been walking without direction for longer than the snow had been falling, longer than he cared to remember, his boots leaving prints that filled and vanished behind him like promises that were never quite kept. The forest around him was the kind of silence that has weight, the kind that presses against your ears until you hear your own heartbeat as if it belonged to someone else, and the colded sound, a faint ringing like glass about to break, and it made him pull his coat tighter, though the fabric was thin and worn through the elbows where memory tends to show itself most honestly. He had been a soldier once, though that felt like another man's life now. A story told about someone who looked like him but moved with purpose, with direction, with a reason to wake in the morning. Now he woke because the cold woke him, or hunger, or the ache in his knees that came from sleeping on ground that refused to soften no matter how many nights you apologized to it. He carried everything he owned in a pack that smelled of mildew and gasoline, and inside it were 3 cans of soup he was saving, a blanket that had belonged to someone else first, a photograph of people whose names he whispered sometimes when the night was too quiet, and a small Bible with pages so soft from touch they felt like cloth, opened always to the same psalm, the one about green pastures, though he hadn't seen much green in a long time, only white and gray and the brown of tree bark, splitting in the freeze. The cabin appeared the way grace often does, suddenly, without announcement, as if it had been waiting there all along, and you were simply too distracted by your own footsteps to notice. It sat in a clearing where the trees pulled back like theater curtains, small and slumped on one side where the roof had given in to years and gravity, its chimney cracked and leaning, its windows dark as closed eyes, and something about it made Thomas stop walking, made him stand there in the falling snow with his breath clouding white in front of his face, because he recognized it somehow, not the cabin itself, but the feeling of it, abandonment, the specific loneliness of a place that had once held laughter and arguments and the smell of coffee in the morning, now holding only air that hadn't moved in a very long time. He stood there longer than he meant to, snow gathering on his shoulders like the hands of patient ghosts, and he thought about turning back, except there was nothing behind him to return to, only more trees and more cold, and the same tired conversation he'd been having with himself for months about whether he was walking toward something or just away. And in the end, it wasn't courage that made him move toward the cabin, but exhaustion, the kind that lives in your bones and makes every choice feel less like choosing and more like falling, one direction or another, and this time he fell forward. The porch steps groaned under his weight, would soft with rot, and he put his hand on the door and felt the cold of the metal handle travel up his arm like a question he didn't have an answer for yet. There's a kind of hesitation that lives in the moment before you open a door you have no right to open, a pause that feels like standing at the edge of someone else's life and asking permission from the air itself. Thomas felt this as his fingers tightened on the handle, the rusted metal rough against his palm, ice crystals forming in the gaps where the door had pulled away from the frame. Over winters, no one had been there to close it properly against. The wind moved through the trees behind him with a sound like breathing, in and out, patient and enormous, and he thought about the difference between trespassing and survival, about whether intention matters when the result is the same. A man entering a place he does not own because he has nowhere else to go. The cabin from the outside looked like something memory had tried to forget, but couldn't quite manage. Its walls were gray wood weathered to the color of old bone, boards warped and splitting where the nails had rusted through and given up their grip, and the roof sagged in the middle like a sigh held too long, shingles missing in patches that let the sky show through in jagged shapes that looked almost deliberate, almost like windows designed by someone who wanted to blur the line between inside and out. There were icicles hanging from the eaves, long and sharp and catching what little light the heavy clouds allowed, and they made a sound when the wind touched them, a faint ringing that reminded Thomas of wind chimes at a house he'd known once, before the war, before the forgetting, though he couldn't remember whose house it had been or why the memory arrived now, in this particular cold. He noticed small things the way soldiers notice small things. The chimney leaning but not fallen, which meant someone had built it well once, had taken time to set stones with care, and mortar mixed thick enough to hold against seasons and storms. The paint on the window frames, faded to almost nothing but still there in flakes of what might have been blue or might have been green, colors that spoke of someone choosing beauty even in a place this remote, this far from roads and towns and the easy opinion of neighbors. There was a horseshoe nailed above the door, upside down so the luck would run out, and Thomas smiled at that without meaning to, smiled at the thought of someone believing in luck enough to hang it wrong on purpose. Maybe as a joke, maybe as a test of faith or fate or whatever thin thread we use to convince ourselves there's meaning in the arrangement of iron and wood and the spaces between. The cold was pushing at his back now. Wind picking up the way it does before dark when the temperature drops fast and sudden, and his fingers were starting to lose feeling where they grip the handle, that pins and needle sensation that comes before numbness, before frostbite, before the body starts making choices about what it can afford to keep warm and what it has to let go. He had 3 cans of soup and maybe 2 days before hunger stopped being discomfort and became emergency. And he had been cold for so long now that he'd forgotten what warm felt like except as an idea, something abstract and nostalgic like childhood or hope. The door opened easier than he expected, swinging inward with barely a sound, just the whisper of wood on wood and the sudden exhale of air that had been trapped inside, air that smelled of dust and mouse droppings and something else underneath, something he couldn't name right away, but recognized in the way you recognize the smell of your grandmother's house or the jacket your father wore. The smell of people, of life lived in close quarters, of cooking and sleeping and breathing in the same small space until the walls absorbed it and held it like a secret they'd promised never to tell. Thomas stepped inside and closed the door behind him, and the silence that followed was different from the silence of the forest, more complete somehow, as if the cabin had been waiting a long time to hold sound again and didn't quite remember how. Inside, the cabin was a museum of stopped time, each object exactly where it had been left when someone, he didn't know who yet, had walked out that door for the last time and never walked back in. And if you've ever entered a place where life simply paused mid-sentence, you know the feeling, the strange reverence that makes you walk carefully and breathe quietly, as if you might wake something that's better left sleeping. And if this moment touches something in you, some recognition of how fragile our claims to any place really are, please subscribe. Stay with us for what comes next, because these are the stories that need quiet people to hear them. The furniture wore white sheets like morning clothes, lumps and shapes that suggested a couch, 2 chairs, a table, all draped and anonymous. And Thomas stood just inside the door for a long moment before he moved, his eyes adjusting to the dim light that came through windows filmed with years of weather and neglect. Dust hung in the air, visible in the pale shaft of winter sun that managed to push through the grime, particles drifting slow and aimless as thoughts you can't quite hold on to. And when he took his first step, the floorboards creaked loud enough to make him freeze, loud enough to feel like an accusation. There were photographs on the walls, frames hanging crooked where the nails had worked loose over time, and he moved toward them the way you move toward a conversation you've been avoiding, slowly, with his hands in his pockets and his shoulders tight. The images were faded, color-bleached to shades of yellow and blue that made everyone look like they were underwater. But he could make out faces, a man in work clothes standing beside a truck, serious expression, arms crossed, a woman in a kitchen, flour on her hands, laughing at something beyond the frame, a child, maybe 8 or 9, holding a fish on a line and grinning with that particular pride children have before the world teaches them to measure their joy in smaller increments. On the table, under a fine layer of dust that looked soft as snow, sat a Bible open to Psalms, and Thomas moved toward it without deciding to drawn by something he didn't have words for, something about seeing Scripture left open like an interrupted conversation with God. The pages yellowed and slightly curled at the edges where fingers had turned them again and again, and he could see pencil marks in the margins. Tiny notes in handwriting so small and careful it looked like lace. One note said when James was sick, another said before the deployment, and Thomas felt his chest tighten because he understood suddenly that this wasn't decoration. This was a record, someone marking the days they needed God most, building a map of crisis and petition, and he wondered if the prayers had been answered or if the book had simply been closed one day and never opened again. He touched the edge of the table, fingertips leaving tracks in the dust, and he felt like a thief though he'd taken nothing, like someone reading a diary that wasn't meant for his eyes, but he couldn't stop looking. There was a coffee cup beside the Bible, still holding the ghost of whatever had been in it, the inside stained dark, a pair of reading glasses folded carefully on a handkerchief, a pocket knife with a horn handle worn smooth from use. And underneath the handkerchief, when he lifted it with care that felt almost ceremonial, he found letters, maybe 20 of them, tied together with kitchen string, the envelopes addressed in the same careful handwriting as the notes in the Bible. But these were addressed to James at an Army post office box, the postage from the early 1950s, and Thomas set the handkerchief back down gently, covering them again. Because some things you know aren't yours to read, even when no one's there to stop you. The cabin was one room with a loft above, a ladder leading up to where he could see the corner of a mattress, and in the back there was a kitchen area, a cast iron stove, a dry sink, shelf that still held cans and jars, labels faded to blank or close enough, and Thomas moved through the space, touching things lightly, respectfully, the way you'd touch artifacts in a museum, and everywhere there were signs of care, of attention, of someone who'd arranged their life here with intention. Firewood stacked beside the stove in a perfect pyramid, pots hanging on hooks in order of size, a broom standing in the corner with bristles worn down but still useful, and it occurred to him that whoever had lived here had been military. He could tell by the precision, the way everything had its place, and that place made sense, economy of motion and space that you learn when resources are limited, and discipline is how you survive. Behind the bookshelf, he noticed it because it sat away from the wall at an odd angle. There was a small door, and Thomas stopped moving, stopped breathing almost, because he knew without knowing how he knew that whatever was behind that door was the reason he'd been led here. If you believed in leading, if you believed the cold and the snow and the 3-day walk had been anything other than accident and desperation. And he stood there in the dusty silence, wondering if maybe you could believe in both things at once, coincidence and providence, the way you believe in weather and God, things that touch you whether you invited them or not. The bookshelf moved easier than it should have, considering the years, considering the weight of books still on its shelves, volumes with cracked spines and titles he couldn't read in the dim light, books chosen for long winters when entertainment meant pages and imagination and the discipline to sit still. And Thomas felt the resistance of wood on wood, felt the groove worn into the floor where the shelf had been moved many times before. A path of habit, of ritual, someone going to this hidden place often enough that the evidence couldn't be erased no matter how careful they'd been. The small door behind it was plain wood, no handle, just a leather strap nailed to the surface for pulling, and when he tugged it open the hinges squeaked high and sharp like a small animal in pain, and the smell that came out was different from the rest of the cabin. Not musty or abandoned, but preserved somehow, cedar and oil and the ghost of candle wax, as if this room had been sealed away more carefully, as if whoever left had wanted this part to wait. He had to crouch to enter, the doorway built low either by design or necessity, and on the other side, the ceiling opened up to nearly full height, a space carved out of what should have been dead area, clever use of the cabin's bones. And maybe you know what it's like to discover a secret room in a place you thought you understood, that sudden reorganization of space and possibility. And if you do, tell me about it in the comments. Because I think we're drawn to hidden things not because they're hidden, but because they suggest that every place, every person has depths we haven't discovered yet. Inside was a workshop, and Thomas stood very still, taking in the way you'd take in a painting or a crime scene, understanding that arrangement tells story, that objects in relation to each other form syntax, grammar, meaning. There was a workbench under a small window, tools hanging on the wall above it in careful rows. Chisels, gouges, small saws, each one clean and sharp despite the years. Someone who'd maintained their instruments even when they weren't using them, maybe especially then. On the bench sat half-finished projects. A wooden truck, wheels carved but not yet attached. A small rocking horse, body smooth and shaped but mane still rough. A cross, simple and elegant, sanded to silk but not yet stained. And Thomas picked up the cross without thinking, felt its weight and balance, felt the hours of attention pressed into every surface, and he knew without being told that these had been made for the child in the photographs. The boy with the fish, these were gifts. Interrupted by something, time or distance or the particular kind of separation that doesn't ask permission. Letters were stacked on one corner of the bench, maybe 50 of them, tied in bundles by year if he guessed right by the way the paper aged from white to cream to yellow, and beside them a cigar box that when he opened it revealed small things, precious things, a pocket knife with initials carved in the handle, a St. Christopher medal on a broken chain, military pins he recognized from his own service, infantry insignia, Korean service medal, Purple Heart, and combat infantry badge, and underneath all of it a photograph, this one clearer than the ones in the main room, less faded, more protected, and it showed the same man from the other photos but younger, in uniform, serious and lean, and standing next to another soldier, both of them squinting in bright sun somewhere flat and foreign, and on the back in pencil. Chosen, 1950 me and Corporal Martinez, coldest I ever been till now. A child's drawing was pinned to the wall beside the window, done in crayon on paper that had gone brittle with age, and it showed a house, this cabin probably, with a big sun overhead and two stick figures holding hands, one tall and one small, and at the bottom in wobbly capital letters, "Me and Dad when you come home." And Thomas felt something break open in his chest, felt it the way you feel a bone crack or ice give way, sudden and complete, because he understood now what this room was. This was a father's hope, a father's project, a father waiting for his son to come home from war so he could give him these things he'd made with his hands in the hours when hope was harder to hold than wood. And Thomas set the cross down carefully and picked up the top letter from the nearest stack, postmarked 1951, addressed to James Bradley at an Army hospital in San Francisco. And he opened it even though he knew he shouldn't, even though it was theft of a kind, but the need to know was stronger than propriety now. And the letter began, "Dear James, your mother and I received word that you're stationary now, but the doctors are hopeful, and I want you to know I've started building again, son. I've started making the things I promised, and I keep them here in a room I made just for this, for keeping safe what I mean to give you when you walk back through that door." The letter continued, but Thomas couldn't read anymore, his vision blurring in the way that has nothing to do with light and everything to do with recognition, with seeing yourself in someone else's story so clearly that the distance between you collapses like a tent with broken poles. And he folded the letter carefully and put it back, and he knew what came next without having to read further. Knew it the way you know how a song ends even when you've never heard before, because some stories repeat, some losses echo across generations. And this father had built and waited and kept his tools sharp and his hope sharper, and his son had never come home, or if he'd come home, it hadn't been in time. And eventually the father had walked out that door for the last time and left everything exactly as it was, frozen mid-sentence, mid-prayer, mid-hope, because finishing it would mean admitting something he wasn't ready to admit. And so the workshop remained, a shrine to a future that never arrived, and Thomas understood this completely. Understood it, so he had to sit down on the floor and put his head in his hands and breathe through something that felt too big for his body to contain. If this moment reached you, if you felt the weight of these two men across decades, please subscribe. It helps these quiet stories find the people who need them. And maybe you're one of those people. Maybe we all are. Night came early this far into winter, this deep in the mountains where the sun never rose high enough to argue with the darkness for very long. And Thomas lit one of the candles he found in the workshop, thick and hand-dipped, wick straight and true, the kind someone makes when they have more time than money and understand that light is currency in the cold months. And by its small flame, he read the letters, one after another, slowly, because reading them fast would have been disrespectful. Somehow, would have missed the spaces between words where silence did its own kind of speaking. The writer's name was William Bradley, and he had been a farmer before Korea, had enlisted at 32 when they needed men and didn't care how old, and he'd served with the 1st Marine Division at the Chosin Reservoir, where the cold, he wrote, made this Montana winter feel like spring, where men froze, standing up, where helicopters couldn't fly, and the Chinese came in waves that looked like the earth itself rising up angry. And he'd written these letters to his son James from a VA hospital. From the farm after that, steady correspondence spanning 3 years, 1951 to 1954, and then nothing, no more letters, and Thomas understood what that silence meant. Understood that some conversations end not because you run out of things to say, but because the person you're saying them to stops being there to hear. James had been wounded in Vietnam. The letters made reference to it obliquely, carefully, the way parents talk around the edges of what terrifies them. And he'd been sent to a hospital in California, and his father wrote about weather and crops and small repairs to the cabin, wrote about a doe he'd seen at the tree line, and how the truck needed new brake lines, and how he'd fixed the roof over the porch where it had leaked, and underneath all of it, never quite said but present in every line, was the plea. Come home, come back. I'm keeping everything ready. I'm making you things to show I believed you'd return. And the last letter, dated December 1954, said simply, James, your mother passed Tuesday, peaceful, in her sleep, and I buried her in the plot we chose years ago on the hill where you used to play. And son, I am waiting for you. I am keeping the home fires ready to light. Come back when you can. All is forgiven. All is ready. Your loving father. Thomas set that letter down and stared at the candle flame bending and straightening in some draft he couldn't feel, and he thought about his own father who he hadn't spoken to in 6 years, didn't know if the man was alive or dead, hadn't sent a letter or made a call, because pride is its own kind of war, and sometimes we fight it longer than we fight any enemy. And he wondered if his father had waited, if there'd been a room somewhere kept ready, tools sharp, projects half finished, or if his father had been the kind to close the door and move on, and he didn't know which would be worse, to be waited for and never return, or to return and find no one had waited at all. The parallel was too clear to ignore, too precise to be accident, if you believe in such things, and Thomas wasn't sure what he believed anymore, but he knew he was sitting in a room built by a soldier for a soldier who'd never arrived, and he was a soldier who'd arrived at a room built by someone else. And maybe that meant something, or maybe it just meant he was cold and tired and reading patterns in a randomness the way humans do when we need the world to make sense more than we need the truth. He found a photograph in the last bundle of letters, tucked into an envelope that had never been sent, addressed, but not stamped, as if William had written it and then decided some things needed to be said in person or not at all. And the photo showed an older William, maybe 60, standing in front of this very cabin. His face weathered and kind and tired in the way that comes from carrying hope too long. And on the back, in the same careful handwriting, James, this is me waiting, 1955, I keep the coffee warm. And Thomas understood then, understood completely, that James had never come home, that whatever had happened in that hospital in California had ended differently than prayer could fix. And William had kept building, kept waiting, kept the cabin ready for a return that never came. And eventually he'd grown old alone and died alone and left everything exactly as it was, because changing it would mean admitting defeat, would mean acknowledging that faith and love and hand-carved toys weren't enough to bring back the dead or heal the wounded or win the wars we fight in the privacy of our own hearts. Thomas blew out the candle and sat in the darkness, and outside the wind picked up and the cabin creaked around him like a ship at sea. And he thought about all the fathers and all the sons and all the wars that separate them. And he wondered if William's ghost was here, if James's ghost was here, if they'd found each other finally in whatever country the dead inhabit, or if they were still separated, still waiting, still holding letters they'd never get to send. And the thought made him tired. In a way sleep couldn't fix, tired the way you get when you realize that sadness is structural, built into the frame of things, something you live around but never quite repair. He pulled his thin blanket around his shoulders and lay down on the workshop floor. And before he slept, he whispered to the darkness, I'm sorry I came late. though he didn't know if he was apologizing to William or James or his own father or himself. And the cabin made no answer except the small sounds houses make when they're settling, when they're taking the weight of one more person who has nowhere else to go. The blizzard arrived the way truth arrives sometimes. Without warning, without mercy, just the sudden understanding that the world has changed around you and you weren't consulted about it. And Thomas woke in the darkness of the workshop to the sound of wind that wasn't wind anymore, but something larger and more deliberate. A roar that shook the cabin walls and made the small window rattle in its frame like teeth chattering. And he understood immediately that he wasn't going anywhere, that the choice had been made for him, that he would stay here whether he decided to or not. And there was strange comfort in that, in having the decision taken away, in being able to stop wondering what he should do and simply accepting what he must. He moved through the cabin by feel more than sight. The darkness complete except for the occasional flash of lightning that came even in winter storms this high in the mountains. Brief illuminations that showed him the shapes of furniture and doorways before plunging him back into black. And he made his way to the wood stove, felt along the wall until his fingers found the matches he'd seen earlier. And he struck one, and the flame was so bright after the darkness that he had to squint, had to. Let his eyes adjust to this small sun he held between his fingers, and by its light he found newspaper, ancient and yellow, dates from the 1950s, news about Eisenhower and Sputnik, and things that had seemed important once and now were just tinder. And he crumpled it into the stove's belly and added kindling from the careful stack beside it. And when the fire caught, he felt something in his chest catch with it, some parallel between flame and hope that he didn't have the energy to examine, but felt nonetheless. The chimney drew poorly at first, smoke backing into the room and making him cough, and he realized the top must be blocked, snow or debris or a bird's nest from summers past. And he opened the damper wider and adjusted the flue and waited, patient because there was no choice but patience. And gradually the smoke found its way up and out, and the fire began to breathe properly, to pull air through the stove's vents with a sound like satisfaction. And the heat started to build, small at first, barely noticeable, then stronger, a warmth that reached his hands, and then his face, and then deeper into the core of him where the cold had lived so long it felt like part of his skeleton. Outside, the storm was erasing the world, snow falling so thick and fast that when he looked through the window, he could see nothing, just white, just the absence of definition. And he thought about how easy it would be to walk out into that and disappear, to become part of the white, to stop being a person with a name and a history, and become just another shape under the snow, waiting for spring to reveal what winter had claimed. And the thought wasn't frightening exactly, but it wasn't comforting either. It was just there, an option among options, and he turned away from the window and back to the fire, because fire is what we choose when we choose to stay. He melted snow in a pot he found hanging on the wall, snow he gathered from the drift that had built against the door, and he drank the water when it cooled enough not to burn, and it tasted clean, tasted like clouds and distance. And he realized he hadn't had clean water in longer than he wanted to calculate, had been drinking from streams and gas station bathrooms and wherever he could fill a bottle without anyone asking questions. And this water from snow that had fallen on this mountain felt like something close to blessing, simple and pure, and asking nothing in return except that he be present enough to receive it. His last 3 cans of soup went into a pot on the stove, and he opened them with the old can opener hanging on a nail, the kind that requires strength and patience, that punches triangular holes and needs to be worked around the rim, the kind nobody makes anymore, but that lasts forever if you don't lose it. And the smell of the soup heating filled the cabin with something that felt like memory, chicken and vegetables and salt, and his stomach cramped with anticipation, with the body's simple, honest response to the promise of food. And when he ate slowly, trying to make it last, trying to taste every spoonful, because he didn't know when there would be more, and hunger had taught him that rushing through plenty is how you forget what hunger feels like, and forgetting that is dangerous, makes you careless with what you have. The storm lasted through the night and into the next day, wind howling around the cabin's corners and finding every gap in the walls, every place where wood had shrunk away from wood, and the snow drifted high against the north side until Thomas thought the cabin might simply be buried, might become a cave of white with him inside like a seed waiting for spring, and the fire became his companion, his conversation partner, the thing he fed and tended and watched for signs of mood or need. And he found more wood in the lean-to attached to the back wall, old wood that had been split years ago and left a season, and it burned hot and clean and smelled of pine and thyme. He read more of the letters, all of them now, sitting close to the fire with the pages careful in his hands because they were fragile and because they weren't his, and he learned about William Bradley's life in pieces, in fragments, the way you learn anyone's life when you only have the parts they chose to write down. He learned about the farm William had lost to bank debt in 1949, learned about the decision to move to the mountains, to build this cabin with his own hands as a place for him, and his wife Margaret and their son James to start over, to live simply and close to something true. And he learned about Margaret's death, about William's grief that was never quite stated but present in the spaces between words, in the way he stopped mentioning the garden she'd kept, stopped talking about plans for the future, and started only describing the present, the immediate, the day-to-day work of staying alive. And as he read, Thomas began to talk to William, began to speak out loud to the empty room, to the ghost or the memory or just the idea of the man who'd built this place. And he said things like, "I know what you mean about the cold, and I couldn't save them either, and I'm sorry your son didn't make it back." And the cabin absorbed these words the way it had absorbed everything else, patient and non-judgmental. And Thomas felt something shifting in him, some ice that had nothing to do with weather beginning to crack. And he didn't know if it was the heat or the solitude or the strange intimacy of reading a dead man's letters to a dead man's son. But something was changing. Some calcification around his heart was softening. And he let it happen because he was too tired to fight it, too worn down to maintain the walls he'd built against feeling anything too deeply. If you know what it's like to find yourself in someone else's grief and discover it fits like a coat you didn't know you owned, stay with me. Subscribe. Tell me in the comments where you're sitting as you hear this, because stories like these need witnesses, need people who understand that sometimes we find ourselves by getting lost in someone else's life first. Dawn came late and doubtful, the sky lighter but not light, gray instead of black, a distinction without much difference except it meant the storm had passed or paused, had taken its fury somewhere else, or simply run out of breath the way even the largest angers eventually do. And Thomas woke on the floor of the main room, where he'd fallen asleep, wrapped in his thin blanket and the heavier quilt he'd found in a chest. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, he woke warm, with his fingers and toes still his own, still feeling, still functional. And the gratitude he felt was so large and unexpected that he had to lie still for a moment and let it wash over him. Let himself feel lucky. Let himself admit that maybe he wanted to stay alive after all, that maybe survival wasn't just momentum but something closer to choice. The fire had burned low but not out, coals still glowing red in the stove's belly, and he fed it kindling and then larger pieces, brought it back to life with the patient attention you give to things that keep you breathing. And when it was blazing again, he stood at the window and looked out at what the storm had made of the world. Everything buried, everything clean, the kind of white that hurts to look at when the sun finds it. Pure and total and temporary, because nothing stays that clean for long. Life always marks things, prints and trails, and the evidence of movement. But for now, this moment, the world looked new, looked possible, looked like a page nobody had written on yet. He made coffee from grounds he found in a tin canister, old coffee that had gone stale, but was still coffee, still carried the promise of bitterness and warmth and the ritual of holding something hot between your hands while you think about what comes next. And he stood at the window, drinking it from a chipped mug, and he thought about leaving, about continuing his walk to wherever walks like his end, and he thought about staying, about cleaning this place, about making it function again, and the choice felt bigger than it should have, felt like the kind of decision that divides a life into before and after, and he wasn't sure he had the right to make it. Wasn't sure this place was just a claim, just because he'd stumbled into it half-frozen and desperate. But then he thought about William Bradley, about a man who'd built this cabin with his own hands and waited here for a son who never came. And he thought about all that waiting crystallized into wood and nails and furniture arranged just so. And he thought about the workshop full of half-finished gifts, and something in him made a sound like a door closing or maybe opening. And he decided, not forever, not with any grand proclamation, but just for today, just for now, that he would stay that. He would take care of this place, that he would honor what William had built by not letting it collapse into the forest floor. And maybe that wasn't the same as earning the right to be here, but it was something, it was contribution. It was the opposite of taking without giving back. He started with small things the way you always start with small things when the big things are too overwhelming to face directly. He swept the floor, dust, and mouse droppings and bits of leaves that had blown in through gaps in the walls, and the broom handle was smooth from use and fit his hands like it had been waiting for them. And there was satisfaction in the simple back and forth, in seeing the floor emerge from under the debris, in making visible what had been there all along, just hidden. And when he was done, he looked at the clean floor and felt like he'd accomplished something small but real, and small and real was more than he'd managed in months. He patched the window in the loft where the glass had broken, using cardboard from a box he found and tape that was old and had lost most of its stick but worked well enough when he doubled it. And the wind that had been coming through stopped, and the difference in temperature was immediate, noticeable, the cabin holding its heat better, breathing less desperately. And Thomas understood that the cabin was like him, like anyone. It needed attention, needed small repairs, needed someone to notice where it was failing and shore it up before it failed completely. And he felt a kinship with it, with this structure that had weathered so much and was still standing, still offering shelter, even when it was worn and patched and held together by faith and friction. He organized the workshop, put the tools back in their places on the wall, swept the sawdust into a pile, and carried it outside to scatter in the snow, where it made small brown marks like punctuation, and he touched each half-finished project, the truck, the rocking horse, the cross. And he made a promise to the air that he would finish them if he stayed long enough, that he would complete what William had started, that these gifts meant for a son who never came home could maybe be gifts for someone else, some other child, some future he couldn't see yet, but could hope for in the abstract way you hope for things when hope is all you have left. He found nails in a coffee can, screws in another, and he repaired the porch step that had nearly broken through when he'd first arrived, and he tightened the hinge on the door so it closed properly, and he cleared snow away from the chimney base so the cabin would breathe better, and with each small task he felt himself settling, felt himself becoming part of this place. Roots growing down into the frozen earth without him quite meaning them to. And by the time the sun was setting, early, always early this time of year, he was exhausted, but it was clean exhaustion, the kind that comes from work instead of worry, from doing instead of wandering. And when he lit the evening fire and sat in front of it with the last of the coffee, he thought that maybe this was what peace felt like, or at least what it looked like from a distance, close enough to recognize even if he couldn't quite touch it yet. Outside, the night came down heavy and star-filled, the storm having scrubbed the sky clean, and Thomas thought about prayers, about whether saying thank you to the darkness counted as prayer, and he decided it did, decided that gratitude was maybe the only prayer that mattered, the only one that didn't ask for anything except the grace to notice what you'd already been given. 3 days passed, or maybe 4. Time moved differently in the cabin, measured not by clocks, but by the arc of sun across the windows, by the number of times he fed the fire, by sleep and waking, and the slow accumulation of small repairs that made the place feel less abandoned and more lived in, more possible. And Thomas had settled into a rhythm, rising when the light came, working until his hands ached, eating sparingly from the supplies he'd found in the cabin's cupboards, canned goods, and dried beans and flour that had somehow stayed good despite the years. And he was learning the cabin's sounds, learning which boards creaked and which were silent, learning where the wind found entry and where the walls held fast. And it felt like learning a language, like becoming fluent in the grammar of shelter and solitude. He was outside splitting more wood from the stack in the lean-to, the axe heavy and perfectly balanced, another thing William had chosen well and maintained better, when he heard the sound of an engine, distant at first and then closer, and he stopped mid-swing and listened the way animals listen when something enters their territory, alert and still, because he'd been alone long enough that the thought of another person felt like an intrusion, felt like the end of something he'd just begun to understand. And he wasn't sure he was ready for that. Wasn't sure he wanted to explain himself or justify his presence or do any of the small negotiations that human contact requires. The truck that appeared was old, maybe 1980s. Red paint faded to pink in patches where the sun had worn it down, and it moved slowly over the snow-packed logging road that led to the cabin. And Thomas stood there with the axe in his hands. Not threatening, just holding it because he'd been holding it when the truck arrived. And he watched as it stopped maybe 20 yards away, and the engine cut off, and the door opened with a squeal of hinges that needed oil. And what emerged was not what he expected. She was old, maybe 70, maybe older, small and compact, in a heavy coat that looked military surplus, and she moved carefully over the uneven ground, using a walking stick for balance. And her face, when she got close enough for him to see, it was weathered and kind and sad in the particular way that comes from grieving someone specific. Not grief in general, but grief with a name and a face and a history you can't forget no matter how much time passes. She stopped a few feet from him and looked at him and then past him in the cabin, and her eyes did something complicated, widened and narrowed and filled and emptied all at once. And she said in a voice that was steady but quiet, "You've been fixing things." It wasn't a question, but Thomas answered anyway, because what else do you do when someone states the obvious except confirm it? And he said, "Yes, ma'am, I hope that's all right. I didn't mean to trespass. I needed shelter, and the place seemed empty. And I've been trying to take care of it, trying to keep it from falling apart." And he heard himself explaining too much, justifying too much, the way you do when you think you're about to lose something you didn't know you wanted to keep. She looked at him for a long moment, and he saw her taking inventory. His worn clothes, his gaunt face, the way he held the axe like a man who knew how to work, the smoke rising from the chimney behind him, evidence of occupation, of care. And whatever calculation she was making behind those sharp blue eyes concluded in his favor, because she smiled, small and genuine, and said, "It's more than all right. I haven't been able to come here since William died, couldn't bear to see it. Falling apart, couldn't bear to not see it falling apart, you understand?" And Thomas did understand, understood completely, and he nodded and set the axe down carefully, and said, "William was your," and she finished, "husband, yes, married 42 years, would have been more, but the cancer didn't ask our opinion." And she looked past him again at the cabin, and Thomas saw her seeing it not as it was now, but as it had been, seeing all the years overlaid on top of each other, translucent and simultaneous. And he understood that memory doesn't live in the past. It lives in places, in objects, in the way light hits a window, or smoke rises from a chimney. "Come inside," he said, and it felt strange to invite someone into a house that wasn't his. But she didn't seem to find it strange, seemed grateful even, and she followed him up the porch steps, the one he'd repaired holding firm under her weight. And when he opened the door and she stepped inside, she made a sound, just a small intake of breath, and she stood in the center of the room, turning slowly, taking it in, and Thomas saw the cabin through her eyes. Cleaner than it had been, organized, cared for, the furniture uncovered and arranged the way William must have arranged it, the fire burning in the stove, coffee smell in the air, and she said, almost to herself, "It's like he's still here, like he just stepped out for a moment." Thomas made tea, finding tea bags in a tin and boiling water and serving it in the same chipped mugs he'd been using. And they sat at the table, the Bible still open to Psalms between them. And she told him about William, about how they'd met after he came back from Korea, how he'd been quiet and kind and never spoke about the war except in his sleep when the dreams came, how they'd built this cabin together, her holding boards while he hammered, both of them young and strong and believing. That hard work and love were enough to build a life on, and sometimes they were and sometimes they weren't, but they tried so hard. She told him about James, about their son who'd been everything to them, smart and funny and good with his hands like his father, who'd enlisted in 1968 because he believed in duty, because he wanted to make his father proud, because he'd been 18 and 18-year-olds make decisions with hearts that haven't learned fear yet. And she told him about the telegram that came in 1969, about how William had read it standing at this very table, and then folded it carefully and put it in his pocket and walked out into the snow and didn't come back for hours. And when he did come back, he'd started building in the workshop, started making things for a son who would never hold them, and he'd kept building for years, kept the cabin ready, kept everything exactly as James had left it, because hope is sometimes all we have, and sometimes hope looks like refusal, like saying no to reality, like building toy trucks for a man who died at 19. If this story is finding the tender places in you, the places that remember loss or understand waiting, please subscribe. These are the stories that matter most, the ones that hurt a little because they're true, and telling us where you're listening from helps us know we're not alone in this, that grief and hope are things we share even when we think we're carrying them solo. Spring came slowly, reluctantly, winter holding on longer than seemed fair and necessary. But gradually the snow began to melt in patches, revealing brown grass and mud, and the bones of things that had been covered for months. Fallen branches, stones, the rusted frame of some machine that had given up decades ago. And Thomas worked outside now, as much as inside, cutting back brush that had grown too close to the cabin, clearing the path to the road, repairing the fence that marked the property. Lionel, he wasn't sure who the fence was keeping in or out anymore. Maybe just marking territory for the sake of marking it, saying this is mine, or this is someone's, this matters to someone. Margaret, that was her name, Margaret Bradley, and she'd insisted he call her Margaret, not Mrs. Bradley, because, she said, formality is for people who don't know each other, and we know each other now. We've shared grief, and that makes us family of sort. Margaret came every week, sometimes twice, her old truck rattling up the road with supplies in the back. Things she thought he might need. Food, candles, a better coat, she said had been William's and would just go to moths if someone didn't. Where at books, she thought he might like old novels about men and mountains and the quiet dignity of endurance. And Thomas accepted these gifts with gratitude that felt larger than the objects themselves, gratitude for being seen, for being considered, for mattering enough to someone that they'd drive an hour on bad roads just to make sure he was all right. She brought news from the town below, small news about small lives, who'd had a baby and who'd gotten married and who'd passed away in their sleep at 87, having lived a good long run. And Thomas found he was hungry for these stories, for the mundane poetry of other people's existence, for the reminder that life continued in its ordinary, magnificent way, whether you were part of it or not. And sometimes she'd stay for hours, drinking tea at the table, telling him about William, about their life together, and Thomas would listen and occasionally share his own stories, carefully edited versions of where he'd been and what he'd done, and she never pushed for more than he wanted to give, seemed to understand that some stories need time before they're ready to be told. He finished the wooden truck, the one William had started for James, sanding it smooth and attaching the wheels and painting it red with paint he found in the workshop, old paint that had thickened but still worked when he stirred it long enough. And when he showed it to Margaret, she held it in her hands and cried without sound, tears running down her weathered cheeks while she smiled. And she said, he would have loved this, would have played with it until the wheels fell off. And then she said, there's a little boy in town, Joey, his father left, and his mother works 2 jobs, and he could use something made with care. Would you want me to give this to him? Tell him it's from a soldier who understands about missing fathers. And Thomas said yes before he knew he was going to say it. Said yes because finishing what William started and giving it to a child who needed it felt right, felt like the opposite of waste, like taking grief and transforming it into something useful. And a week later, Margaret brought a photograph of Joey holding the truck, grinning, that uninhibited grin children have before self-consciousness teaches them to smile smaller. And Thomas pinned the photo to the workshop wall next to the drawing that said, me and Dad when you come home. And he thought about how some promises get kept even when the people who made them are gone, even when the keeping looks different than anyone planned. He started going to town with Margaret. Not every time, but sometimes, riding the passenger seat of her truck with the window down, and the spring air smelling of thaw and mud and green things pushing up through the earth. And at first he was nervous, afraid of people and questions and the weight of social expectation. But Margaret knew everyone and introduced him simply as Thomas. He's taking care of William's place. And people accepted that, asked no uncomfortable questions, treated him with the casual respect rural people give to anyone who works hard and doesn't complain. And gradually he became part of the landscape, familiar, expected, the man at the cabin on the mountain. And it was strange and good to have an identity again, to be something other than invisible. He went to church with her one Sunday, a small white building with a steeple that leaned slightly to the left and pews that creaked under the weight of the faithful. And the pastor, a young woman with kind eyes and a voice that carried without shouting, preached about the prodigal son, about coming home, about how grace means being welcomed back to places you thought you'd forfeited the right to enter. And Thomas sat in the back pew with his head down and his hands folded, and something in him broke open again, broke wider. And when the service ended and people shook hands and welcomed him, he shook back and said, "Thank you," and meant it so deeply he could barely get the words out. Margaret introduced him to Frank, who ran the hardware store and needed someone to help with deliveries. And Thomas said he could do that, could lift and carry and drive. And Frank hired him on the spot, paid him cash every Friday, and the work was simple and physical and satisfying. And the money meant he could buy his own food, could contribute to the cabin's upkeep, could stop feeling like he was taking without giving. And the difference this made in how he saw himself was profound, was the difference between charity and dignity, between surviving and living. He carved more things in the workshop, working in the evenings after deliveries, learning from the tools and the wood and the half-finished projects William had left behind, and he made simple things, bowls and spoons and crosses, and Margaret sold them at the church fundraiser, and people bought them, said they were beautiful, said they could feel the care in them, and Thomas thought about how strange it was that his hands, which had once been trained for destruction, could make things that people called beautiful, could create rather than eliminate. And he wondered if redemption was always this quiet, this incremental, this much about showing up and doing the next right thing without fanfare or proclamation. Summer came, and the cabin was no longer cold but warm. Windows opened to let in the breeze and the sound of birds and the smell of pine. And Thomas planted a garden in the space where Margaret said William's garden had been. And he planted tomatoes and beans and squash, things that grow without much fuss if you water them and keep the weeds down. And watching things grow from seeds felt like a miracle, felt like proof that time moves forward, that death isn't the end of everything, that life insists on continuing if you give it even the smallest opportunity. Fall arrived with its particular golden light, the kind that makes everything look precious and temporary, and Thomas stood on the porch with coffee in his hands. Not the cheap instant coffee he'd found in the cabin, but good coffee Margaret had brought, ground fresh and rich and dark. And he looked out the mountains that had seemed so hostile in winter and now seemed protective, sheltering, and he thought about the word home, about what it means, about whether it's a place or a feeling or just the absence of a need to keep moving. The cabin was his now in all the ways that mattered. Margaret had insisted, had drawn up papers with a lawyer in town and transferred the deed, said William would have wanted it, would have loved knowing someone was here caring for what he'd built. And Thomas had protested, but not very hard because he wanted it. Wanted this place, and this life, and this second chance he hadn't known he was being offered when he'd stumbled half-frozen through the snow 10 months ago, and when he'd signed the papers. His hand had shaken not from cold this time, but from the weight of being given something precious, something he hadn't earned but was being trusted with anyway. He'd finished all of William's projects, all the wooden toys and crosses, and the rocking horse that now sat in Joey's room in town. And he'd started his own projects, started making things without models or instructions, just working with the wood and seeing what emerged. And he found he was good at it, found he had patience for the slow revelation of form, for letting the grain guide him, for trusting that beauty doesn't have to be forced. Sometimes it just has to be uncovered, and people in town had started requesting things, a chair, a table, a jewelry box for a daughter's wedding. And he made them carefully, made them well, and the money was modest but enough, and enough is sometimes the best thing money can be. Margaret came for dinner every Sunday now, and Thomas cooked, simple food, nothing fancy, stew and bread and vegetables from the garden, and they ate at the table where William had eaten, where James had eaten as a child, where the Bible still lay open to Psalms though Thomas had started reading other parts too, working his way through slowly, not looking for answers exactly, but for company, for the voices of people who'd also struggled and doubted and kept going anyway. And after dinner, they'd sit on the porch and watch the light fade and talk about small things, comfortable things, and sometimes they'd sit in silence, and that was comfortable too, the kind of silence that doesn't need filling. He'd written a letter to his father, after months of thinking about it, after finding the right words, and then throwing them away and finding different words, and he'd mailed it with no expectation of response, because you can't control how other people receive your apologies. You can only offer them honestly and hope. And 3 weeks later, an envelope had arrived addressed to him, to Thomas at the cabin's address, which meant his father had kept the letter, had read it, had taken the time to respond. And inside was a single page that said, "Son, I'm glad you're safe. Glad you found a place. Your mother and I would like to visit if you're willing. No pressure, just know the door here was never closed." And Thomas had sat on the porch and read it 10 times and then called the number at the bottom. And his father's voice had been older than he remembered, rougher, but warm. And they talked for an hour about nothing important and everything important. And at the end, his father had said, "I'm proud of you." And Thomas had said, "I'm trying." And his father had said, "That's all any of us can do." The workshop was full now, full of projects in various stages, full of sawdust and the smell of wood and oil and the evidence of attention. And sometimes Thomas would stand in the doorway and look at it and think about William, about James, about all the fathers and sons and the ways we fail each other and forgive each other and keep trying despite the failures. And he'd say thank you to the air, to the ghosts, or the memory, or just the idea that nothing is wasted if you're willing to learn from it, if you're willing to take what's broken and make something whole. He had friends now, real friends, people who called to check on him and invited him to dinner and showed up when they said they would, and he was learning how to be a friend back, how to show up, how to listen, how to offer help without making it feel like obligation. And it was harder than it should have been after years of isolation, after years of believing he was better off alone. But he was learning, was practicing, was getting better at it the way you get better at anything through repetition and patience and a willingness to be awkward until awkward becomes comfortable. Winter would come again, was already coming if you knew how to read the signs. Geese flying south, leaves turning, the particular slant of afternoon light. And Thomas was ready for it this time, had wood split and stacked, had the cabin sealed and solid, had supplies and warmth and plans, and he thought about the difference a year makes, about how last winter he'd been dying by inches, and this winter he'd be living by choice. And the distance between those two states was measured, not in miles, but in moments, in small decisions made again and again to stay, to try, to care about something more than he cared about his own comfort or his own pain. He stood on the porch as the sun set, the sky going orange and pink and purple like a bruise healing in reverse. And he thought about the man who'd walked out of the snow and into this cabin, that hollow-eyed stranger who'd been him but felt like someone else now. And he thought about the man he was becoming, still broken in places but broken in a way that let light through. And he thought about William and James and Margaret and his father and all the people who'd given him pieces of themselves without asking for anything back. And he thought about grace, about how it arrives unannounced and undeserved and asks only that you accept it, that you say yes to the possibility that maybe you're worth saving after all. He raised his coffee cup to the mountains, to the cabin, to the workshop, to the life he'd found by getting lost, and he said out loud to the evening air, to anyone listening, to God if God was there, or to himself if not, "Thank you, I'm home." And the words hung in the cold air like breath, like prayer, like promise. And then they faded, and he went inside and closed the door and lit the fire and began the simple work of living. One day, and then another, one choice, and then the next, and that was enough. That was everything. That was grace in its most ordinary and magnificent form. The chance to try again, to matter again, to be part of something larger than your own story. And he took it, grateful and careful and determined not to waste it. And the cabin held him the way William had meant it to hold someone, anyone who needed holding. And outside the stars came out one by one like small promises being kept. And the world turned and the night deepened, and Thomas was, for the first time and longer than he could remember, exactly where he was supposed to be. If this story found you at the right moment, if it warmed something in you that needed warming, subscribe to this channel. Our dream is to gather 1,000 hearts around this fire, 1,000 people who believe that quiet stories of second chances matter. And tell us in the comments where you're listening from tonight, because knowing you're out there Knowing these words reach you wherever you are makes all the difference, makes this worth telling, makes us all a little less alone.